table.
Yeah.
Good morning. Welcome to this Retail Industry and FMCG Advertising and Media Trends panel discussion. The fast-moving consumer goods or FMCG segment remains an extremely busy and highly competitive landscape for advertisers. Ornico has conducted research and analysis looking at some advertising trends, new creative executions, developments, and spending patterns for the financial period that began in March in 2020 up to February 2021. So in the next 45 minutes, we will unpack what some of these trends mean from a retail and strategy perspective. Joining us on the panel this morning is Mbulelo Pahlana, who is the Digital and Media Manager at Reckitt Africa. I'm also joined by Francois Van Dijk, who is the Head of Operations at Ornico. So if you are out there watching us right now, send through your questions. We will be able to address your questions a bit later on during the conversation. And let us know where you're joining us from as well. And yeah, we'll be happy to hear from you. Okay, so Francois, over to you. I'd like to hand over to you as you start us off with some of the latest findings, and what the report entails, because the report will form a large part of our discussion. I see that we've got people tuning in from Facebook and YouTube already. There's also, if you're not on any of these platforms, or if you're watching us from any of these platforms and your colleagues want to watch this, they can also go onto the Ornico LinkedIn page, because we are live there as well. Over to you, Francois.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Obviously, from a Ornico perspective, those of you who are familiar with us or not, we do measure and monitor advertising. We've done it for almost 30 plus years. We do editorial monitoring and gather trends and all of that, social media, all of those. But specifically today, we're going to look at some advertising trends. I'm only going to take you through some of the highlights in a very short presentation, 4 or 5 minutes. Obviously, you can go and download the full report, which is quite comprehensive, from our website. So I'll only be looking at some of the highlights which stood out to me doing this research. As Mongezi said, the FMCG market is huge. It's very busy, very competitive. And it was interesting to see how things changed and what the impact of things like COVID was. I mean, we're not specifically looking at the COVID period, but you could see definite trends in that perspective. So I'm quickly just going to start. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully all of you will be able to see my main screen right about now.
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. So as Mongezi said, we looked at the financial period, March 2020 to February 2021, and roughly the research is broken down into 3 core areas. There was what we call newcomers, so it's new executions that we tracked across multiple media, etc., etc. Then we'll do a bit of a dig into television spend trends, and finally into radio as well from a spend kind of trend perspective. So if we look at the category, we tracked about 485 new executions over the period, of which the vast majority appeared in television, just showing how powerful television still is. We tracked 84 brands that launched new commercials, which is interesting when we are going to look at the spend trends. And we saw Nivea launching the most new executions with 58 ads in total. Beauty care, detergents and soap, were the most busy categories, really, and most of the new commercials were in English. So quite a busy category. As we said, what we're also seeing is a lot of combined language commercials. So, for instance, English and Zulu, or English and Afrikaans, or English and Xhosa, Zulu and Tswana. What was interesting for me as well is that despite the COVID period and lockdowns, we still tracked 44 new outdoor executions in this period, just showing how popular outdoor still is as an advertising perspective. If we start looking at the trend spend for television, we tracked almost 365,000 spots across 85 television channels. It shows you how busy it is, and almost 3 billion rand total ad spend according to rate cards. Looking at the period with the highest ad spend, as well as the most number of spots, was October, for instance. And if we look at most new commercials, they were also launched roughly in the same period for November. And we'll see similar kind of trend on radio as well. Most of the spots we tracked were in English. Interestingly, by far the biggest spender was Sunlight, with almost 86 million rand spent. SABC earned the highest amount of ad spend, while Navia, as we said, they had a lot of new executions, also flighted the most spots for the period. Sundays, very popular day, saw most flightings, followed by Friday. And we still see, and this is also evident in the radio trends, is that the 30-second commercial still reigns supreme and is very popular. What was very, very interesting for me is that Judge Judy on CBS Reality was actually the individual program which featured by far the most spots at 4,500 spots. Now, I didn't realize Judge Judy is that popular, but obviously a lot of spots airing in that time frame. Looking at other programs, the biggest ad spend from a program perspective was obviously the soapies. We're looking at Scandal, Rhythm City, Scheme Song, Muvango, Generations, all of them garnering quite a lot of ad spend. What was very interesting for me, though, is if you look at the top 10 programs, Scheme Song and Generations features twice, because even the repeat broadcasts of these programs and soapies got a lot of ad spend. Stations, as we could expect, SABC 1, which has got the highest viewership, it's got the most ad spend, followed by ETV, SABC 2, and SABC 3, showing the power of the free-to-air stations still. Looking at radio, we saw much less activity on radio. So to give you an idea, we said earlier that we tracked 84 brands that launched new executions. Looking at television, we tracked over 228 brands. So if you consider all the advertising across both these mediums, obviously a lot of the commercials are older and was not necessarily launched in this period, but comes from the previous years. I mean, just from an anecdotal kind of perspective, watching some commercials over the weekend on the free-to-air channels, which I don't usually do, I noted commercials which I know is at least 3 to 4 years old. So a lot of old executions still appearing. Looking at radio, as we said, television, we saw the highest spend plus the most spots featuring in October, while in November, the highest numbers of spots were in November for radio, and the highest ad spend was in December. Once again, Sunlight by far the highest spend. And just as part of some useless information I picked up the other day while I was doing some other research. Sunlight was actually one of the first brands ever to advertise in cinema, going back to 1897. That's more than 120 years ago, and they were already groundbreaking then from a cinema kind of perspective. Um, as we said, 30 seconds, very, very popular still as a length of advertising. Mongezi FM also got by far the highest number of ad spend. Uh, you know, considering that it is not just South Africa, but also Africa's biggest station, so a very big listenership there. Different to television, where Fridays and Sundays are very popular days, we see Thursdays and particularly Wednesdays being the most popular days for advertising. What was interesting to note across both TV and radio spend and spot trends was, if you compare March last year, March was still relatively very good and busy, but we saw an immediate drop in both spending and the number of commercials being flighted or aired in April, May, and June before recovering from July. Um, and this was exactly the same pattern for both television and radio spend. And both actually saw May receiving the least amount of ad spend and spots. So if you compare, for instance, March television advertising last year, we saw about 34,000 spots being flighted for a total ad spend of 240. But if we compare that to May, uh, the number of spots on television dropped to 16,000 and ad spend half to 125 million. Now, exactly the similar kind of patterns comparing March to May last year, uh, happened on radio, where also the number of spots and the ad spend between March and May dropped by almost half. Now, you would consider that obviously with the hard lockdowns in April and still relatively hard in May, um, there would have been an uptick with people being at home, watching more television, listening to the radio. So it's interesting to note that it looks like the advertisers took a much more cautious route. And I think that's very much to do with the DTI government kind of regulations around essential goods. There was so much confusion around it. What is considered essential goods? We saw uh, some retailers not selling shampoo, but others did. So I think there was a lot of confusion around that period, and advertisers took a cautious approach um, when it came to advertising. But from July, it sort of started recovering, peaking in the October to December period. So if we look at the top 10 brands for radio, as I mentioned, Sunlight Reckitt was quite a clear big spender there, followed by brands like Handy Andy, Nivea, and quite a few others. Day parts very popular around the lunchtime period, and then going towards the late afternoons. A lot of spots being flighted there. And like I mentioned, the report is actually very detailed, much more information than what I touched on now. So I'm really looking forward to hear the panelists' insights from an insider perspective. As I mentioned, we look at it from independent perspective, so it would be interesting to hear their comments from that. So please go to our website. You can download the full report. It's about 20 pages. And we're happy to hear from you and get your comments around this. Thanks, Mongezi. That's me.
Thank you very much, Francois. That was very insightful. Yeah, so the report, as Francois said, will be downloadable from the Ornico site. Yeah, so we'll share information around this later today. If you look out on our LinkedIn, Twitter accounts, and everywhere else. And now just to get on to the discussion and to introduce our guests who are joining us this morning to share some insights. Mbulelo Pahlana is the media and digital manager at Reckitt Africa. He has a strong passion about media, brands, and communications with 8 years of industry experience. He has worked on a range of industries, including FMCG, alcohol, and other premium brands. Mbulelo, welcome.
Thank you, Mongezi.
We also have Refiloe Mashaba, a senior strategist at the Avatar agency, who is a brand enthusiast and has delivered strategic solutions for various brands and clients from FMCG, financial services, telecommunications, and a myriad of other brands and industries as well. Refiloe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'll start with you, Refiloe. Following the presentation by Francois, what are some of the leading advertising brand trends that you've noticed across FMCG and retail, let's say in the past year?
Yeah. So it's been very interesting for us because I think, we came out of, we were going hard, going in terms of our strategies, finding new and innovative solutions. But what we still had was a lot of brand functionality across the space. And I think, the move into digital transformation and how that has continued has really led us to see that, brands, of course, where you used to notice that, your e-commerce platforms or your digital and social type of strategies were sort of add-ons to your brand strategies and your communication strategies, started to become a fundamental part of every single strategy. So brands slipped straight into e-commerce, they slipped straight into digital, and we started seeing that being quite big. Another key thing was this growing focus on storytelling. More brands were coming forward and saying, we need to relaunch or redefine what our purpose is. We need to show empathy with our consumers. So how do we actually do that? How do we get back into that space? A lot of brands that were sort of dormant, they were selling really well before the pandemic, are now starting to sort of want to have that engagement. And then I think the third one, of course, was the year 2021 now being the year of the influencer. So really starting to tap into those spaces in order for us to really effectively reach our consumers. But ultimately, the new currency is engagement, right? So that's where, for me, the top three were really starting to become more prevalent in this space.
Thank you for that, Refiloe. It's very fascinating that you mentioned storytelling as a big one, because you also noted that, especially across digital and social media, which I want to get into briefly with you, Mbulelo, because of course, working a lot with not just media but digital, I'm sure you also must have looked for or found ways of sort of storytelling across digital platforms, especially with a lot of brands now not advertising, as Francois said a lot, especially around March, April, because there was a bit of a lull. Are you finding that trend, which kicked off during COVID, continues going forward?
Definitely. I do believe that it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Again, I echo what Refiloe has just mentioned around the move from focusing on brand functionality and product functionality. As you previously know, a lot of products would focus on the composition of the product. So what the cleaning agent is. And we found that people don't necessarily understand all of that technical jargon and all the site, as you know, like a lot of the soap advertisements would show laboratories with people like scientists. So moving away from that technical space and telling compelling stories, because at the end of the day, what people are looking for are solutions, and solutions need to be shown in the sense that we need to articulate what the brand does for your in-home space, for instance. And what social media does is that it enables you to tell that story in a longer format, as opposed to only looking at TV, because with TV you only have 30 seconds to tell the story and limited budget. With social media, you're able to then tell a longer story using very innovative solutions such as your live streaming, or using live stories, or even using influencers, obviously, like as Refiloe mentioned, to sort of deliver that more compelling story. And we also know that people generally sort of are more susceptible to influencer conversation, because they follow those people and they see them as ambassadors, etc. So I definitely see it sort of carrying on. I don't foresee at the end of COVID being the end of the purpose-led storytelling. I see brands really delivering more compelling stories and aligning to their purposes a little bit more.
Very, very interesting. So one of the things that I think we note quite a lot, especially in the South African context, is that a lot of South African consumers across, especially across the FMCG space, are not using digital a lot, or they don't have access. They don't have as much access to data. So, Refiloe, what are some of the strategies that you've seen brands using to balance this with the growth of digital on one hand, and a radio station like Mongezi, as Francois mentioned, being as big as it is in South Africa and across the African continent?
I think that's what I was mentioning around the fact that, this sort of space was something that was an add-on. And the thing is, now it's becoming more prevalent and is becoming more important, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we cut off everything that we've been doing. One of the key things that I should mention is that, with every single strategy that we have been doing, a lot more research into consumers, more in-depth research into consumers have come to the fore. We had our usual communication strategies, but those are really starting to be supported by understanding pain points even better, understanding needs even better, understanding, how users use their channels, how people use their channels rather. So again, we still have to focus on different aspects, different types of consumers, and deliver to those consumers, because we ultimately don't want to find ourselves in a spot where we're alienating anyone. But of course, like I said, we also have to start being part of the solution, and also showing people in terms of digital transformation and how we can do that as brands. And I think the kind of roles we want to take on. But again, like I said, we are still very much using our old channels, but we're finding innovative ways to use them, right? We go into different media sort of strategies, we go into digital strategies, we look at our radio executions, and it was quite interesting that I think it was Francois who mentioned that, it is sort of on the decline. But it's interesting because we still use those strategies. We still think they are effective when we are targeting specific consumers. So it's all around getting the right targeting, right? And making sure that our channels are specific to those people, and the messages that we bring out are relevant and resonate with those audiences. And that's what's really important for us at this point.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Mbulelo, what's your take on that?
I think exactly what, towards the end, what Refiloe said. I think we need to understand that media fundamental will always remain. From a principle point of view, we need to understand what the purpose of each channel is. And once you start identifying that and then aligning that to your audience, then you're creating effective communication strategies. That's the one principle, the guiding principle that will never change, regardless of COVID. We always know that TV, for instance, is mass media. It is for your wider audience, and it allows you to broadcast at a national level. What radio then does, it allows you for that little bit more hyper targeting to allow you to target regionally or at a city level, for instance, which obviously TV doesn't necessarily allow you to. What digital then does, it gets you to that next level, which is more of a personal level. You create comms that are dedicated or are specifically or strategically created for that individual. And what that does, it allows you to have multiple communications using a very limited budget and multiple creative executions for your individuals. And that is why we're starting to see more and more brands that are using multiple creatives in order to deliver one message across a various or a wide audience base. Again, going to the fact that, to the point that TV we know is very expensive. I'm always going to use this as a base. We know that we have 30 seconds and it's going to cost you 120,000, for instance, for one 30-second advertisement on a generation or whatever it is right now. However, you can really use those resources to carry a very long digital or maybe 2 to 3 month strategy with multiple creative executions that will allow you to reach a plethora of your audience base, right? And I think what it all boils down to really is obviously with COVID and everything, we realize that consumers have less money in their pocket, and with that, obviously, business revenue is dwindling. So, what are we able? What is the lower hanging fruit in terms of return on ad spend? The answer is simply digital, as we know, because with digital, you're able to literally factor or attribute that 1 rand that you spent to an action. So where it be a lead in the form of in an automotive industry, a test drive, or a sale on an e-commerce platform such as your Takealot. So ultimately, the fundamental, the guiding fundamentals, as I said, are still there. It's just a matter of understanding the audience, as Refiloe rightly said, and then tailoring your strategy to that audience.
So how has the massive change in I mean you've worked across many brands, right? And you've been in the game for a long time. How has, I think, the change that came in with COVID sort of influenced your strategy going forward? Because strategy will never be the same for brands, and where money is spent and where advertising spend is put. How has this fundamentally changed your planning and your strategy?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that came with COVID as a benefit, coming from a client hat as well as an agency hat, is the fact that it allowed us to focus, be deliberate, because we understood that we don't have the budget that we used to have where we could do everything. What is it that is most important for the strategy or the need for the brand at that particular time? Yeah. So that's what I love about it, because previously we find that we had this huge budget that was just sitting there, and we literally wanted to do everything. And what COVID has allowed us to do as strategists and advertisers is say we've only got 100 rand, and with this 100 rand, we have to ensure that we reach the widest, most relevant consumer base for our brand. And that has gotten us to go through a process of elimination to say, look, TV would be great for this particular campaign. However, it's not needed, because ultimately what we're trying to do here is convert. And this brand is all about conversion on an online platform. So we will forego such platforms such as TV, such as your radio, and we will specifically focus on fundamentally bolstering up our digital presence and allowing the consumer to convert while we have them on the online space. So it's all about focus and being deliberate in strategy, something that has always been, I feel, quite a daunting task to always have to reiterate the focus element, because like I say, our competitors are everywhere, and we also want to be where our competitors are. And that's not necessarily the right way in which we need to approach our strategies.
Exactly.
So, Refiloe, how have you seen brands, or at least the FMCG space, changing in terms of what brands and clients now want to prioritize versus what they wanted to prioritize, say, 6 months or a year ago? And do you think,
No, sorry, carry on.
No. So basically, I'm finished. I think that's basically it. And what are they prioritizing?
So what's been, and I agree with Mbulelo, because I think, it's given us a lot more direction, even from an agency perspective. One of the key things is, you'll get a brief that used to have everything on it, and everything that needs to be done for Monday. But now you're getting, more synchronized briefs. You're getting the right objectives from clients, because I think what they need to do is they haven't really thought about that space. And now they're saying, we want to create awareness for a period of we want to drive consideration for a period of. These are the sort of results that we're looking at. And I think that's been very instrumental to us from an agency perspective. And then also just to note, in terms of where FMCG is going, it's very interesting because I think from a client perspective and from an agency perspective, it has to be more of a partnership. So that's what we've been looking more at and really working with our clients to make those certain campaigns come alive. The key thing, like I said, for us is engagement, right? So brands are starting to really intercept the conversations that they're seeing online. What are those sort of, like I said, how do we empathize with consumers? So we're really starting to look at our briefs in a different way, and also starting to challenge clients. Really starting to say to them, this is what needs to be your focus. If we look at maybe the four sort of phases, your disrupt, your engage, your act, and your advocacy or your loyalty. How are we speaking to each of those points? And that is ultimately what we want to see within the space. And I think carrying on, it's going to be quite interesting. And I don't know if we'll ever have a post-pandemic, but this new normal that is now normal, we'd like to see a lot of that come through, especially even if we look at purpose-driven brands. That's become so important. And that's where we would like to see more of the briefs coming through in terms of our end.
You mentioned a lot of things there. I mean, I picked up the purpose-drivenness as one of them, and the other that you spoke about quite a bit, I think, is the importance of measurement. That I guess brands want to measure more and measure more effectively. Are there any strategies that you found in recent times or have been using in recent times and will be using a lot more to measure the success of various campaigns across various touch points? Because of course, I mean, you've got X amount of spend within FMCG, and you need to measure at every point, right? So how are clients looking at measurement, or are they looking for more, better, more sophisticated measurements? And what's happening in that space?
Measurement has definitely blown up for us. And I think the key thing from a strategy perspective when it comes to measurement for us is how do we ensure that a brand remains competitive, remains differentiated, but most importantly is proactive. And that's where a lot of the measurement sort of thinking would sit. We're not, previously we'd go head to head with brands. This brand is doing this, so we have to do that. And that's not the space we want to play in. So when we look at measurement for us, it's really just around what conversations, for example, are happening, and then how do we intercept those conversations, and then how do we create creative that is proactive to what the next conversation will be. So I think that in turn will give clients a little bit more value in terms of even just the work that we create, the streams in which we create that work in. It's always very proactive. If tomorrow, it's the end of the pandemic, we have something for that. So measurement for us is very important, but also just to understand what are those sort of intersections between interactions. So between all of these things that we are doing, is our communication effective? Is the channel that we're using correct? All of those sort of questions that we have to continuously ask ourselves. And what I like about what Mbulelo was saying in terms of that we're more concentrated in what we're doing is that it doesn't require, a 180 turnaround. It's just about fixing those small things and we start to get right. So it's been very helpful on our end as well.
Absolutely.
I just want to add something on there, if you don't mind.
Sure,
I think
absolutely.
The measurement factor is now something that is more operational than it was previously prior to COVID, I believe. So you'd find that we'd have a strategy, a campaign that would run for 6 months. And what would happen is that you'd have the campaign strategy up front, briefing, etc. Then you'd go into execution and implementation mode, and then everything would sort of just like be quiet. And then it's just about the campaign running. And then you get to the end, and then you have the post-campaign analysis, and then in that session, things were like, we actually found out. We didn't deliver on this. Why was this happening? And there was a lot of accountability passed on to the next person or the next agency, specifically when you're working with big brands which have multiple agencies. So you have your platform or influencer, or you have your PR, or you have your media creative. So you find that, and that's where the turmoil would come in. Now what you find with brands is that you're having that more on a weekly, daily basis, and it's defined as good practice to have those conversations on a more weekly basis, and you call those optimization sessions, sprint sessions, whatever you want to call it. When you start seeing issues within that, you quickly have a quick workshop within that session to identify opportunities to obviously pivot or change what is not working, and ultimately at the end, you're sitting with a more successful campaign, if I want to call it, because there always will be issues. However, now that you know that we are having a more close relationship with the measurement aspect, it allows you to deliver more effective campaigns. And I just wanted to add that piece on over and above what Refiloe had said.
Yeah. And just to note,
so from a sure, Refiloe, go ahead.
The other key part of measurement that we've discovered is that clients are it's not just about a KPI dashboard anymore, right? They're starting to, in between campaigns, we'll find like, let's just get a quick focus group together and see if people are actually resonating with our messaging. So I think even just measurement going beyond the digital sort of numbers, we're seeing clients be more interested in actually sitting with people and understanding, what is it that you understand about this communication? And then we can go back and do all those little extras. So it's actually quite great, I think, yeah.
What we also noted a lot in the past year is that a lot of long-standing mainstay print publications either went digital or reduced frequency. How has this change from, I guess, print, which again has great reach, to now moving to digital, changed strategy and thinking from both the brand side and I think the agency side that drives brand thinking? I'll start with you, Refiloe.
So I think for us, a lot of changes have forced us to be more agile in our thinking, more flexible in our thinking. And I think, there'll always be a level of uncomfortability when we start to think about who we're targeting and how we're targeting. And now that, we don't have necessarily this particular publication on this platform that will reach these kind of people. But effectively, my best answer for that is that we try and find these alternative solutions. So for example, if we're trying to maybe do community-based, we'll start looking at maybe community-based type platforms or print publications. So it's all around finding and just being more creative around it. And then again, just to say, the move to digital is really about brands also supporting that space for their consumers. What are brands doing to ensure that their customers are also being fully entrenched into the digital aspect? We know, of course, like you mentioned, data is quite an issue. But, there are certain sort of, innovations that we can have in place to sort of bring those customers on board. It's very important for us to not forget the customer behind. And the brands that succeed are the brands that go to the customers firstly and then come along on the journey with the customers across the board. So again, like we said, we can't avoid a lot of changes, but we just need to be agile and creative and innovative in our solutions and in how we actually target our consumers and finding those hyper-personalized ways to reach them.
That makes sense. And Mbulelo, what's your take on that? I mean, how has this decline in print and print going digital changed strategy in your perspective and spend as well?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think ultimately, and this is the best answer from my end as well. I mean, I don't have the definitive one. I mean, we all know that media landscapes will always continue to change, and with that, obviously, the way in which we communicate with our consumers. For me, it boils down to the guiding principles once again, in that what is it that we're trying to do with the brand, and what is it that we are trying to accomplish with the consumer or through the consumer, or however you put that. I for one still do believe that there is a role for print, given the right audience. So it's again about defining what that is, who that person is, because you might find that there are a lot of more people that are sitting in the lower spectrum of the Allison group that are still very much engaging with your cheap dailies, and there's an opportunity for brands to then use that platform in sort of very creative ways or like outdated ways, such as couponing or those kinds of things, or sample opportunities to ensure that the audience or the consumer ultimately tries your brand. So as much as it's unfortunate that there is this move, and it's also guided by the fact that people don't also have all the time in the world anymore, of
Yes.
being able to be across, to have the time to be using all platforms or using
Yeah.
all forms of media,
Yeah.
where previously people had a little bit more time, like that dwell time. They would be watching TV, that very defined sort of ways in which they interact throughout the day. Hence, we have the day in the life of a consumer. But we also know that that's changed quite a bit, because there's so many things that consumers are exposed to and things that they need to do. And with that, obviously, there are going to be certain things that are going to fall away, such as your print, and then digital then becomes that next thing. We know that data obviously now is a cost, but I mean, it's more accessible for people to be online through
Mm.
various incentives that either one, the telecommunication companies have for consumers, or by sort of like if you load airtime, you get points, and then you're able to buy data. So I mean,
Yes.
with that, I mean, there had to be some other media touchpoint that would fall away. However, that being said, there is still a role for print as a medium. You just
Yeah.
have to define the strategy and the role for it within your strategy.
Now, one of the key things, or one of the mainstays, I suppose, in the South African context is obviously traditional media. Just stepping back now a little bit from print, with with TV and radio still being very dominant, and of course there's the growth of digital. Where is spend from a brand perspective leaning towards, with both, or at least all platforms or all mediums, still very significant in the customer's context?
So could you just please repeat the question part? Sorry, Mongezi, I just lost
Sure. So
the.
so 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 in terms of spend, like, where is your spend sort of leaning towards? Where's
Yeah,
the focus more? Because you can only spend X on either
yeah,
platform. What are
yeah.
you, I think from a brand perspective first, I think, what are you leaning towards in terms of your focus and your spend?
I, I think the ambition is to move towards digital. Definitely, that's the ambition. That being said, we still need to understand the context of our market and our audience and our population being South Africa. That we still have a high degree of penetration on TV, or a traditional audience, or media rather. In that we're sitting at 90% penetration for TV. Digital is sitting at about between 60 and 65%. And with that, you find a lot of people that are have more than one device that they connect on digital platforms with. And that obviously is duplication, and we don't necessarily factor that. So if you take 30% of that, then we're sitting at, let's say, 20 million people, or whatever it is. Sorry,
Yes.
even less than the 60% that I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think with the ambition being digital, we need to be very careful in how the journey is guided by brand. We
Sure.
need to understand our brand consumption, our audience consumption habits rather, and how they interact with brands and their media touchpoints. So, like again, I'll use the LSM sort of spectrum. We might still find that the lower LSM people are still very much dedicated to TV, and they're watching a lot more TV than they are digital. Whereas you find the more affluent group of people have more access to your digital platform. So it really needs to, again, go back to what your brand objectives are and who you are as a brand communicating with. That will largely then define the strategy and the spend that you need to align with the media strategies. Sorry, Mongezi, you're mute.
Yeah, the most searched term in 2020. So if you're out there, we are taking questions. I'm seeing a question has come through on our in our comments. We'll address that in a moment. Refiloe, what have you noted? I think the same question as well, but more from, I guess, an agency perspective. Where is spend leaning towards? Because there's growth in digital, but a lot of South Africans and a lot more people are on traditional media platforms with TV and radio in the lead. And Francois mentioned that the likes of a Judge Judy, for instance, and Rhythm City are still really popular programs on our TV screens.
So I agree entirely with what Mbulelo was saying. It really, again, it's around that consumer and who you want to target. And I think it is quite interesting, the Judge Judy comment. But again, when we're saying brands need to be where consumers are, it makes sense, right? So during those periods of Rhythm City and generations, that's where the bulk of that brand's consumer is. So of course they would essentially want to advertise there. The key thing that I think what we're saying about, the digital sort of space is that it is becoming a bigger part of the strategy. But of course, TV and radio are still one of, I guess, for lack of a better word, sort of your primary sources. But what we're trying to essentially provide here is a 360 total customer experience. And when we think about that omni-channel sort of way, how do we ensure that what you see on TV still translates to what you see on digital, still translates to what you see on print, where you're getting the same sort of message, obviously hyper-personalized to the individual, but you still understand what that golden thread is. So we essentially, if you're on digital, we essentially want you to get to a place where if you're on digital, it almost feels like you're sort of in that same space and you're still getting to that reach and you're still getting that awareness. But yeah, primarily we're still looking at your TV and your print.
Okay. Thank you for that. We've got a question that has come through from Roche on YouTube. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Roche is kind of how I'm reading it. How relevant is database collection in the digital advertising era? I'll start with you, Refiloe. How relevant is database collection or the collection, I suppose, of customer data and utilizing that customer data for more effective advertising and brand communication?
Data is gold. Data is what we love. The more data we have, the more we can, bring upon the right strategies. So it's still very much important. And I think even now, even more important, because we essentially, customer shifts and customer behaviors and attitudes are consistently changing. We are finding ourselves in spaces where people needed to be, people needed more value. And now value has been, blasted out. Brands need to understand that we were in a space of, like, sorry, I forgot the previous gentleman's name, who mentioned around the fact that, customers are sort of sitting in the space where it was essential brands in the beginning, right? And now brands who were not necessarily considered essential are now trying to find a space of visibility in terms of how they package their products and all of that stuff. So when we look at the data and we understand where consumers are, we understand what they're doing, we understand what sort of products appeal to them, we understand them in terms of automation, it becomes so important for us because then we can consistently use that data, consistently retarget them with the right stuff that they need. And that's what's essentially important for us. So data for me is that's the first question I ask when we get a brief. What have you got in your stream that you can give us that we can use? And I think that's important. And companies don't realize how much data they have. Companies are sitting on troves of data that they either can't access, they don't know how to use, or they don't know how to interpret. And that's very important going forward for me, especially as a strategist.
Mbulelo, how are you?
Sorry, guys.
Sure. How are you, I think, collecting and utilizing data for more effective advertising, and what sources rather are you using for your data? I mean, you don't have to be very specific about your secret recipe, but what kinds of data do you use or utilize from, I guess, both a communication and advertising perspective, and I'm guessing, a brand, like a product development or changes that the consumer's giving you sort of perspective?
So I think, to what Refiloe said, data is gold and data is the new currency. So any form of data is important, to be honest. Whether it be at this point cookie data, as we know that obviously the phasing out of cookie data is something that is yet to happen, but for right now it's still very important. Whether it be personalized data in the form of name, surname, gender, etc., whether it be cell phone data through USSD mechanics, all forms of data is very important, because what it allows you to do is to reconnect with the consumer. And reconnect with the consumer in the most appropriate or most relevant manner possible. Because what it does, it articulates that person for you, or it gives you a view of, you have spoken to this person previously. So now when you re-engage the person, you need to move the conversation to the next level. So that's what data allows you to do. So going back to the question, I think data in all forms should be one of the objectives of every digital campaign. How are you collecting data, and what are you then doing with that data, and how do you ensure that that data remains relevant? Because we know that there are a lot of policies, such as your POPIA Act, etc., that have guiding principles in terms of what you can do with data and how much you can store that data for, how long rather you can store that data for. So it becomes very important to utilize that data as frequently as possible to ensure that you can house that data in your database for a longer period of time. There's no use in keeping data, taking Refiloe's name and surname and then just holding on to it and wishing for dear life it's going to do something. You need to use that data. You need to create strategies to understand how you can use that data in the most resourceful manner that's going to benefit the brand. And is that a newsletter? Is that a text? It doesn't matter. As long as a person has subscribed, you have to use that data and ensure that you continue to use that data. So ultimately, the first thing that you need to unpack from from a data strategy perspective and objectives is how are you able to create an opportunity to collect data from your consumer that then engages with you. For sure. So I hope that answers the question on the panel.
No, it definitely does. It definitely does. Definitely does. I just want to add a bit of a tiny question there before I take one more question from LinkedIn. What kinds of, I mean, we talk a lot about data, and data is probably one of those words that is potentially overused in marketing. And I want to ask, what are some of the nuanced, interesting insights that you've got from any of the data that you've collected over time? Because I mean, I'm guessing you collect this data, of course, to have increased, better consumer insights, right? Are there things that you can point to, or insights that you can point to, even if it's a single insight that you can point to, that you only have because you collected a certain type of customer or user data?
I think so one of the things that we have seen in the time that I've worked with data over the years is there's a lot of, in South Africa, the one thing we need to understand, we've got a huge cultural diversity, right?
Sure.
And with that, data allows you to understand the implications of that. So the way in which the creative is articulated for one culture might be negatively received by another. So what data then allows you to do is then align your creative to a culture rather, right? So those are the tiny nuggets that we use. It's for me, I always base it on creative for the biggest part, because it's the easiest one to articulate. But those are the things that you see, like for instance, if let me not go into specific.
I think we can all think of at least one example, creative or piece of communication that means something for one culture and misconstrued for another. In your perspective, Refiloe, what interesting insights have you seen in recent times around the data that you were either able to collect or at least receive from clients?
So I think it's the same, looking at culture, looking at dialects. But another thing that data has helped us is really essentially using innovation better. So I'll give you like the simplest example that's just popped into my head, like geo-targeting, for example.
Yes.
We're able to just use that more effectively because we know where you are at that time. So we're able to advertise to you in the right way with the right message. So I think, how it has helped us, in terms of understanding people, understanding consumers, understanding landscapes, but also just in terms of how we look at innovation, how we use it, and even how we come up with innovation. I worked on a while ago, we were looking at launching sort of a new, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but it was a new vehicle at the time. And we were looking at how do we use social media and innovation to really like target these people when this thing is happening? How do we create the right content around it? And it was all around finding, who is this consumer? Where are they right now? What are they doing? So if someone was closer to a dealership, we knew that, okay, cool, this is the right time to say, come back tomorrow or whatever the case is. We've got something, we've got a new surprise for you. So it's all around those new sort of nuggets that we were able to use to craft better campaigns, but just to be more innovative, just to think more creatively, to search for innovation. So we start looking at, we look at the data that we have, we then go into more research around what is the lead category perspective, what are they showing us? And then how do we start to implement those kind of solutions to show our customers that we are thinking, we are future-centric in our thinking, and we're very solutions-orientated. So I think it's quite nice for us, especially like Mbulelo was saying, from a creative perspective, but also from strategy sometimes. I mean, sometimes we have fun.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very wide ranging and it gives you a lot. It gives you a lot of insights. Yeah, I get you. I'm going to take just one last question from our viewers before we wrap up. This one is coming from Dodi, directed to you, Refiloe. Hi, Refiloe. I really like what you mentioned about proactive and personalized advertising. Could you kindly share a case study of how you guys executed that on a social media campaign?
So I think, in terms of, I won't go into a straight case study, or maybe I'll upload one on my LinkedIn. But with the key thing with social media, and again, because it's so immediate and because it's so, we get so much engagement, is that it works out really well because we'll have streams of creative that are already loaded. We even think about or consider time of uploading. We consider current conversations within that space. So when we talk about proactive thinking, for example, we really think about, okay, cool, tomorrow we'll have the president's address. I don't know. We won't, but tomorrow we'll have some sort of event that's happening, rather, let me say that. What are those sort of key executions that we can have if it's a yes, if it's a no, and if it's a maybe? So I think, we've taken our strategies from more of a, more than just comms and more than just digital. And we're now starting to show clients the practicality of that execution and what that execution would look like in terms of different times of the day, if that's what it is. So from a social media campaign, again, it's more beautiful and it's more centered in that proactiveness. And we've utilized that a lot with our brands. But I'll definitely have a case study for you. I can see we are running out of time. A case study on my LinkedIn profile. I'll
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Please do. And if you share it, I mean, we'll also share it as well. In closing, Mbulelo, with all the changes we've experienced in the past year, what advertising trends do you think will drive FMCG and retail?
So I think Refiloe touched on this very much all the way up front, in that brands need to start taking a strong stance in developing purpose within their communications, moving away from brand functionality alone to try and convince the consumer or win the consumer over. We definitely see that as one of the biggest trends. The other obviously will be measurement. Definitely, we need to start defining our measurement up front in the sense that KPIs need to be clearly defined and workshopped by both partners, so agency as well as client. So no longer client just briefing it in and wanting the agency to come back. We need to all sit around the table and actually workshop what the best success metrics would be for a campaign. And obviously, ultimately, digital will definitely be the biggest trend that we'll still see for the foreseeable future, and how we close the loop on digital platforms with our consumers. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Well,
Thank you,
yes,
Mbulelo.
I can't ask that question because Mbulelo's taken all the good answers.
So I'm sure you have I'm sure you can add a lot more, or add a few more different things there.
No, so I think Mbulelo has mentioned them all. I think it's about how do you take your brand, and for me that functionality aspect is so important. How do you go and create real experiences for consumers? How do you create a level of exchange? What is your value? How much do your consumers mean to you? You know, all of that stuff is so important when you look at, you know, a customer as a person. You step out of being a marketeer and you really start to live the life of that consumer, and that's the only way that we will be able to really understand them, and then of course deliver the right messages to them. And obviously, you know, you want to be more than just advertising.
Sure.
People need us, or look at brands now as coping mechanisms for how they live, for you know, what they stand for, what are the sort of things that they believe in. And I think brands need to be more entrenched in understanding themselves, purpose-driven, so that they can have more value in the lives of their consumers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, just to wrap up, some of the things I picked up, of course, are that brands need to be even more purpose-driven than ever, because the space is so competitive. Measurement will absolutely take the lead, and more effective measurement of that, not just as opposed to vanity metrics or vanity measurements. Partnerships are a massive thing, and partnerships between brands and agencies, as well as between agencies, brands, as well as their customer, the people they're communicating with, and hyper customization. If that's, I think, and digital will continue to take the lead. So brands need to be thinking a bit more around that. And if you are on the stream online out there on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, thank you very much for joining us for this FMCG advertising and media trends discussion. The reports that we were discussing and the reports that Francois shared earlier will be available for download. Just look out for us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on Facebook. We will share links and URLs around when that report is available. It should be today or tomorrow. And thank you for all your questions, really insightful questions that you sent through. And for some of our latest updates, follow Ornico on LinkedIn, on Twitter, or on YouTube. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Bye.